Hi there, and welcome back to Skrælige. We left off in the year 1200, when the western Norse settlements consisted of Iceland, the eastern and western settlements of Greenland, Leifsbuðir on the northern tip of Newfoundland, Straumfjorð in the northeast of modern Nova Scotia, Humarvik in the southwest of modern Nova Scotia, and Skrælige. Most of the settlements were doing well, or at least sustaining themselves, but Leifsbuðir and Humarvik were not. Leifsbuðir was only really able to sustain a small ship repair outpost, and the permanent settlement exhausted all the natural resources nearby. By 1225, the last permanent residents left, and Leifsbuðir became just an uninhabited stopover point. By the 1250s, Humarvik was next to go. A combination of conflict with the Micmac, bad harvests, and disease meant the remaining inhabitants packed up and left. Some went to Straumfjorð further east, but a decent portion moved to Skrælige, helping grow its population. Further east, the Kingdom of Norway was reaching its peak, and in 1261, Greenland formally joined Norway, and then from 1262 to 1264, the chieftains of Iceland and the Kingdom of Norway came to an agreement called the Old Covenant. These changes led to increased trade between Greenland, Iceland, and Norway, as well as an increase in settlement of Iceland. Greenland was a little bit too cold to convince people to move there, though. This left Straumfjorð and Skrælige as the only remaining settlements that were not under the rule of the Kingdom of Norway. The abandonment of Leifsbuðir and Humarvik made the transatlantic route quite a bit more dangerous, and the focus on Iceland and Greenland led to a bit of a decline in trade. It wasn't really feasible to incorporate Straumfjorð and Skrælige into the crown, but regardless, they were within the sphere of influence of Norway. So one of the things we have to talk about is metallurgy and the different metals available to Skrælige. The best metal they had was iron, because steel was rare enough that it didn't really make it over to Skrælige. And iron was somewhat common, but it had to be transported all the way from the east because there was no iron in the ground around there, or really anywhere in the New England area. With the trade starting to reduce, there was a need to get some sort of metal replacement, and there was native copper in the area. By native copper, that's just copper that doesn't have to be separated from any other ore. It's just there. It's copper. Combined with some tin nearby, they could smelt some bronze, and they'd have a decently strong metal, especially when you consider that bronze making was not commonly practiced anywhere in North America. Metallurgy in general just wasn't. There was some use of native copper, but generally speaking, you could get better results just using obsidian. In 1243, the Skræligans founded a small mining settlement just to the southeast by a cave on the side of Mount Thor, and they slowly began to turn this cave into a mine to get more copper, and began a small bronze making operation. It wasn't as strong as any of the iron, but this made it the strongest metal that could be produced in North America at the time. On top of the new mining operations, winemaking grew into a substantial industry as well. Vinland, the name for the region around Leifsbuðir, was named for the vines of the grapes that grew there, and Skrælige's soil was even better suited for it. There wasn't a substantial farming operation for grapes in Skrælige until the late 1200s, with some immigrants from Leifsbuðir moving in. That began large-scale winemaking operations, which made it a common industry. By 1300, the practice of slavery in Skrælige was extinct. There had only been 12 thralls, as they were called, in 1200, but in the years that followed, their children were granted freedom, and there were no new slaves added. There were no wars at the time, so there was no prisoners that could be used for slavery. and there were none imported, so the practice became extinct by itself. There was kind of a cultural opposition to it, since so many people had moved to Skrælige for their own freedom from their own life, so they weren't really disposed to taking slaves of their own. After the Manntal of 1200, there had been some supplemental counts, but there hadn't been another thorough recounting. So in the year 1300, the Thing commissioned another full census of all of Skrælige, and the results were that the population was now up to 751. With the abandonment of the other settlements in North America, an influx of more people came into Skrælige, and while more housing was built, there was kind of a need for a new village to be settled as well. So in 1350, Nyrvænn was built on the coast, which would have made it good for trade, except the abandonment of settlements meant that there wasn't really much anyway. But there's some fishing and some farming, and that sustained it. But with all this new immigration, the relations with the Abenaki nearby grew pretty strained. The larger population emboldened some Skræligans to move further inland for fishing and hunting, and the Abenaki were somewhat forgiving. They didn't want to get into a war, but eventually there was no choice. On the 15th of May, 1374, a band of Abenaki snuck into the edge of Midotunga and set fire to the village. By the time the sun came up on the 16th, half of the village was destroyed. An emergency meeting of the Thing was called, and a group of men and women armed themselves to launch a counterattack on the nearby Abenaki village, but it did not go well. As the Skræligans marched through the woods, they were ambushed by Abenaki arrows. Around 100 had entered the woods, but only 28 returned home. A handful were made captives, but the rest were killed in battle. After that, a peace offering was made. In return for the captives, the Skræligans would give several sheep and pigs, and they promised to never set foot further inland than Midotunga again. The Thing agreed to the terms, but this meant that the fragile links between the Skræligans and Abenaki was completely severed. Back in Skrælingborg, though, the population continued to grow, and despite the lessening trade, it was enough to support a decent base of artisans within the city. So denser multi-story half-timbered housing was built between the main walled settlement and the Floodvegga. That was the flood wall along the Sigyn River. And this allowed for the population north of the walls to more than double, shifting the center of population from near the church and the market further northward. And after the conflict in May 1374, the need for better defenses was apparent. The wall before then had only covered the original center around the church and the market and some of the houses there, but now most of the population was outside of the wall. So over the next few years, a big stone wall was built, parts of which survive to this day. That wall would go all the way around the village, straight up to the river. Finally, though, in 1380, grim news came from the east. Straumfjorð was emptying out, and now the nearest inhabited Norse settlement would be Greenland. The settlements in Greenland weren't doing especially well either. The western settlement had been abandoned a couple decades earlier due to a combination of colder climate, erosion, and conflict with the incoming Thule people. And the eastern settlement was definitely past its heyday. Straumfjorð was completely abandoned by the end of 1382, and this meant that the journey east was no longer feasible. The trade had already been on the decline, but this spelled an end to it. And the conflict of 1374 meant that local trade wasn't really an option, and Skrælige would have to be self-sufficient. This began a period known in Skræligan history as the Isolation, when contact with the old world was lost for over a century. A bit after this happened, in 1400, the population had grown to 1043. The effects of the isolation had yet to take hold. There'll have to be more of that, though, in the next chapter. As always, thank you for watching. Feel free to either watch the other videos or read up on the website for the earlier history of Skrælige. More will come eventually. There is no schedule for this. And have a good one.